In today's quiz, I'll be asking 10 questions on Edward III, one of England's most popular medieval kings. With each question, there'll be 4 possible answers to choose from. I'll pause for a few seconds after each question to give the viewer some time to think about their answer, though if you need more time, you can of course pause the video. The answer will be given on the following slide. Question 1. Edward III's father, Edward II, was famously deposed by his own queen Isabella. Following this, Edward II was then allegedly murdered at which castle? Was it A. Warwick Castle, B. Dover Castle, C. Berkeley Castle, or D. Corfe Castle? The answer is C. Berkeley Castle. Edward II, having been shunted around the country somewhat after he was forced to abdicate his throne, ended up at Berkeley Castle, where he was treated in a much more hostile manner than he had been up to that point. In September 1327, Edward II was likely murdered, although some historians question this and believed he may have escaped overseas, which is highly unlikely. It's also unlikely that Edward was murdered with a red-hot poker. Question 2. What was the name of Queen Isabella's ally who helped her overthrow Edward II? Was it A. Simon de Montfort, B. Roger Mortimer, C. Hugh de Lacy, or D. Guy de Beauchamp? The answer is B. Roger Mortimer. Having grown fed up of Edward II ignoring her for favourites like Hugh Despenser the Younger and earlier in the reign Piers Gaveston, Isabella was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of the French king Charles IV, who was also her brother. Her son, the future Edward III, soon joined her and remained with his mother in France, despite his father's desperate pleas for them to return to England. It was during this time that Isabella allied herself with Roger Mortimer and possibly became his lover. Mortimer was also disgusted by Edward's relationship with Despenser, and he became the king's enemy. He was thrown into the Tower of London but made a dramatic escape. In 1326, he and Isabella launched an invasion of England, which would lead to Edward II's downfall. Question 3. After 3 years of acting as regent for the young king, Edward III, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer were dramatically arrested by Edward at which castle? A. Nottingham, B. Leeds, C. Windsor, or D. Pontefract? The answer is A. Nottingham Castle. By the autumn of 1330, Edward III was approaching his 18th birthday, and now more than ready to rule for himself. But Isabella and Roger Mortimer had grown too fond of power. During their regency, Mortimer in particular had grown especially egotistical. It was said during Parliament sessions that Mortimer would receive a greater reception than the king himself, and that when walking alongside Edward, Mortimer would walk deliberately and disrespectfully slightly in front of the king. He and Isabella had also benefited greatly financially from their time in power, and had acted as far worse tyrants than Edward II had ever done. Edward III, still furious at the fate of his father, and now a mature young man, crept quietly into Nottingham Castle one October night, accompanied by some loyal friends, and dramatically arrested Mortimer. Roger Mortimer would be hanged at Tyburn, and Isabella exiled from court in disgrace. Question 4. Who was Edward III's queen? Was it A. Matilda of Flanders, B. Eleanor of Provence, C. Philippa of Hainaut, or D. Anne of Bohemia? The answer is C. Philippa of Hainaut. Edward II had made inquiries as to a potential marriage alliance between his son and a daughter of the Count of Hainaut, but it was Queen Isabella, seeking aid from the Count for her campaign against Edward II, who arranged the betrothal. During their first meeting, the younger Edward is said to have left a strong impression on Philippa, and she was in tears when he sailed away. In 1328, the two married, and Philippa would serve her husband nobly in a long, successful, and happy marriage. Question 5. In what year did Edward III defeat a Scottish army at the Battle of Halidon Hill? Was it A. 1330, B. 1333, C. 1336, or D. 1339? The answer is B. 1333. In the years following the death of Robert the Bruce, Scotland had slipped into turmoil. Robert had been succeeded by his 5-year-old son, David II, and a man named Edward Balliol took advantage of the uncertainty that often came with a child king and defeated a force loyal to David in battle and had himself crowned king. Balliol found himself an ally in Edward III, who, like his grandfather Edward I, was happy to meddle in Scottish affairs. The English king defeated a Scots army at Halidon Hill before Balliol paid homage to Edward at Newcastle upon Tyne. The following year, the 10-year-old David turned to France for support, a country that Edward II would soon be turning his own attention to. David in the 1340s would be captured by the English and spend over a decade as their prisoner. Question 6. Who was King of France at the outset of the Hundred Years' War in 1337? Was it A. Louis X, B. Philip VI, C. John II, or D. Charles VII? The answer is B. Philip VI. Although the traditional years given for the Hundred Years' War date 1337 to 1453, the relationship between the two countries of England and France can be dated back to the Norman conquest. And long after the war supposedly ended in 1453, with English kings such as Edward IV and Henry VIII contemplating, and sometimes more than that, a potential conquest of France. Philip VI had supported David II's cause in Scotland to Edward III's irritation, and the English king, a nephew himself of 3 kings of France, responded by laying claim to the French crown. And so, one of history's most famous and enduring conflicts was born. Question 7. In 1345, Edward III's daughter, Joan, was betrothed to Prince Pedro of Castile, and in 1348 she began her journey to officially marry Pedro, but she never made it. Why? A. Her ship sank. B. She was recalled to England after a disagreement between Edward and the King of Castile. C. She died of the plague on the way there. D. She refused to marry Pedro and instead went to live as a nun. The answer is C. Joan died of the plague. Europe was now on the brink of a terrible outbreak of the Black Death, which would devastate much of the continent's population. All but one of Europe's kings avoided the plague. Ironically, the only European ruler unlucky enough to die of the plague was Alfonso XI of Castile, Pedro's father, and Joan's prospective father-in-law. However, royalty wasn't immune from the disease, as Joan's tragic death at only 14 showed, and it's possible that Edward III lost two of his other children in infancy to the plague in the 1350s. Question 8. Who, for most of Edward III's reign, was the heir to the crown of England? Was it A. Edward the Black Prince, B. Lionel of Antwerp, C. John of Gaunt, or D. Thomas of Woodstock? The answer is A. Edward the Black Prince. In 1346, the Black Prince had shown himself to be a quite brilliant knight, as, aged only 16, he helped defeat the French at the Battle of Crecy. A decade later, at Poitiers, he captured the King of France, John II. He was one of the defining figures of chivalry in the Middle Ages, but the Black Prince could also be terribly ruthless, as the sack of Limoges showed all too clearly. A lifetime of campaigning eventually took their toll on the Black Prince, and his last years were dogged by ill health, and he died a year before his father in 1376. Question 9. Who was Alice Perez? A. A wet nurse for the royal children. B. One of Queen Philippa's ladies-in-waiting. C. The first wife of John of Gaunt. Or D. Mistress to Edward III. The answer is D. Mistress to Edward III. By the 1370s, with old age fast approaching and his beloved Philippa dead, Edward found solace in Alice, although he was being played for a fool. The once mighty warrior king was now vulnerable, and Alice helped herself to many jewels and expensive gifts, all the while pretending to be Edward's trusted confidant. It's even said she took Edward's ring off his finger as he lay dying. Unsurprisingly, she was despised by many, and deservedly lost most of her ill-gotten wealth. Question 10. Who succeeded Edward III as king? Was it A. Richard II, B. Henry IV, C. Edward IV, or D. Stephen? The answer is A. Richard II. Richard of Bordeaux, son of the Black Prince, succeeded his grandfather as king when he was aged only 10 in 1377. He would prove to be a very different character to both his father and grandfather. He avoided war, and during his reign, the conflict with France fell into a period of relative calm, although the French had threatened to invade England in the early days of Richard's reign. Richard was a naive man and fell into the same trap earlier kings had done by becoming too familiar with certain men in his court, thereby allowing jealousy to develop elsewhere. Richard was not necessarily a bad man or even king, but his eventual deposition in 1399 was entirely avoidable.